again, garden friends. Welcome to this October day. This is one of my favorite times of year, but it's also one of the busiest in the garden. I have so much to get done. Really quickly, I wanted to say if you have recently been affected by the hurricane or the massive flooding, I hope you are safe. I hope you are well. The same for your family. My family and I are definitely praying for you. Here in southern Indiana, we got nowhere near the devastation that so many people are experiencing, but we did get a lot of rain and some high winds. So my summer garden that was pretty much finishing up anyway is definitely done. I have several larger plants that got knocked over, and all the moisture kind of made all the fungal diseases that were already happening on things like tomatoes even worse. So I have a lot of plants that need to be pulled out. I just finished doing a huge harvest of a lot of those tomatoes and cucumbers, maybe even the last one, as I'm going to pull most of these plants. I do still have quite a few fall plants growing, so I will show you those, and they'll continue to grow up until our first frost. So this cleanup will be a several week, maybe even a month long process, but I did want to take you along today and show you a few tips and tricks, things that I do to prepare my garden, specifically my soil, for exposure to winter elements. I'm going to show you a few of the things that I do to help support pollinators and other beneficial insects and wildlife over the winter. I'll show you what I do or don't do with all of these plants that are coming out of the garden, and a few other little gardening hacks I've learned over the years. First, let me show you what I have growing for fall. Here I have a few different kinds of storage cabbage, and I keep these covered as long as possible, maybe even the entire time. This just really helps with those cabbage worms and the flea beetles, and since they don't need to be pollinated, most fall vegetables can stay covered. Here I have several different kinds of cauliflower that's going to need to be uncovered because they're getting too tall for these row covers. I also have some cabbage down at the end of the bed. I also had a potato that I apparently missed when I was harvesting this past summer. I know it's an early variety, so I'm hoping I can get a small harvest off of it before the frost hits, but we're just letting it grow. And down here are those ruby ball cabbages. Here's just a really small planting of carrots. These are bolero carrots. They're a really good storage variety. I had a huge carrot harvest earlier this summer, so I just wanted something small and manageable this fall. Here's some broccoli that needs to be staked up soon, and these row covers are kind of a mess. Like I said, we had some high winds come through, so that's on the to-do list as well to get these straightened up. In this metal raised bed, I have some arugula that I started indoors a few weeks ago. I just direct sowed some cilantro. I have green onions that are still growing strong. I think I planted these in early spring, and they're still doing great. I have some pak choi here and some salad bowl lettuce here. I do get asked about these metal raised beds a lot. These are from Garden in Minutes, and you can get them in a bundle that comes with these watering grids, and these watering grids are all season, so you can leave these out over the winter. That is so nice. Before, I've always had to take up my soaker hoses and then put them back out in the spring. I don't have to do that anymore. I have 3 30-gallon grow bags with sweet potatoes growing in them. I planted these earlier this summer. I've planted sweet potatoes in grow bags the last several years. They've done really well, and these I will harvest usually right before my first frost. Here are the other 2 grow bags with sweet potatoes. These are parsnips, and they always start to look a little rough this time of year. This is the longest growing plant in my garden. It's planted in early spring, and I don't harvest them until after first frost. Part of the reason they are looking a little rough, though, is actually a happy reason. Let's see if I can find one. There. I have several swallowtail caterpillars on these plants. I started to cover them because I know the birds, there's another one. I know the birds really will take advantage of these little guys, but I try to just leave wildlife alone. I know the birds also need food sources, but I'm hoping that these will create their little chrysalises soon, and we'll have some swallowtail butterflies in the garden. Let's see if I can find another one. I see the dropping trail. Let's see. Oh, there's one right here. At one time, I think I had 5 or 6 that I counted on here. A few of them might have been snacks for the birds. And I do still have quite a few peppers growing. Peppers are always so slow to mature for me, so I let them go as long as I possibly can. I have several varieties planted. This is a Sugar Rush peach pepper. I have Mad Hatter peppers. These are my favorite kind of snacking pepper. I also have some jalapenos growing here and some sweet banana peppers as well. As far as the rest of the garden, I have a lot of cleanup to do. You can see several of these plants fell over. This is all basil that I let flower. And you know, the pollinators love it. I try to keep it up as long as I can, but because of the way it fell, it's really hard for me to get around and work in this garden, so I'm gonna pull most of it up. Here's a tomato bed, and you can see how bad the blight really got to these tomatoes. I do have a really large okra plant down at the end, and at this point I'm just letting them go so I can collect some seed. It is a shame because these tomatoes were really productive until we got all that rain. I can pick a few to do some fried green tomatoes, but a lot of them just have rotted. But here's a quick tip and something I do with a lot of this fruit. I don't usually compost it because there's so many seeds, and I'm not great about keeping my compost hot over the winter, and then I will end up with a ton of seed in my compost, and when I spread it around the garden, I will get volunteers everywhere. And while sometimes volunteers can be great, they can be overwhelming. But what I will do to sort of give myself a little bit of a hack or a head start on seed starting, if you have an heirloom variety, these are San Marzano, I'll take the fruit and I'll just kind of bury them or just put them in a little out of the way corner in the garden. And a lot of times next year I'll get seedlings come up, and that way I know exactly what they are and they're easy for me to transplant around the garden, and I can control where they grow so they're not coming up in the middle of larger plants or anywhere where I don't want them. And you can do that with a lot of different plants. I do this with cosmos, I do this with ground cherries. So just take some of the fruit or the dried seed heads of the flowers, find a little out of the way corner of the garden and plant them there, and hopefully you will have some seedlings come up the following year. Really quickly too, I wanted to show you my cold frame. I just planted spinach on this side and some lettuce on this side. And this cold frame is one of the ways that I grow fresh greens throughout the winter, as well as a few different ways indoors. But this is something that we had built and installed, I think last year. It's been such a great asset to the garden. Right now I have it propped open because we're still getting pretty warm days and it does stay pretty warm in there, and those spinach and lettuce seedlings don't like a lot of heat. Let's talk about your soil, because I preach building up your soil so much because it really is one of, if not the best thing that you can do for your garden. Healthy soil means healthy plants, and when you take the time to feed your soil and not your plants, you're investing in long-term health for your garden. Your plants will be healthier, they'll grow better, you'll need to use less fertilizer, and they'll also be healthier plants that are better able to resist things like disease and pests. So we really want to think of soil as a living thing, because it is really, or at least it contains living things. You know, things like earthworms that help break down organic matter, their castings are really great for soil. Things like roly-polies and ground beetles that help break down organic matter. Hey, Scout, she's coming to help. Even down to microscopic things. And these microscopic beneficial organisms, they help break down nutrients in forms that plants can use them. So there's so many reasons that we need to treat our soil as something living. And so what do living things need? Well, they need food, they need water, they need to be protected from the elements. And one of the quickest ways to deplete your soil is to leave it bare over the winter, where it's exposed to harsh conditions, where it's exposed to erosion. It causes so much nutrient loss. And again, we're not giving anything for those living things within the soil to eat. So I recommend in fall you mulch your garden with 3 to 4 inches of an organic material. So this could be leaves. I use these all the time because they are very readily available to me this time of year. They're also a great balanced source of nitrogen and carbon, so they break down and compost really well. They do a great job of feeding the soil. You could also use things like straw. Straw bales are easy to find this time of year. You just want to make sure you're getting straw bales and not hay bales, because hay bales have could contain a lot of grass seed. Straw can too, but usually not as much. Just be sure that you're asking if the straw was treated with any sort of herbicide, because we don't want to bring that into the garden where it could affect the growth of your plants next year. You could also use things like pine needles. I love pine straw mulch. It's one of my favorite mulches to use, especially in the summer. You could also, if your plants are healthy and haven't really had any issues with disease, you could do something called the chop and drop method. And this means that you're going to prune the plants off at the soil line, and this will leave the roots of the plants in the soil, which adds organic matter. It's a food source for all those beneficial microorganisms we've been talking about. And then you can take the stems and the leaves and chop them up into smaller pieces and then use them as a mulch on top of your beds, and they'll break down just like the leaves, just like the straw, and they'll feed your garden over the winter. Here's sort of what that would look like. This basil has been pretty healthy, so I'm going to leave the roots in the soil. So I'm going to prune it off at the base. Then, leaving the roots in the soil, you could chop all of this up and leave it as a mulch on the garden. Now, basil's not a great example because it has these really woody stems and they would take forever to break down. But I can leave a lot of these leaves and some of the flower heads to break down and feed the soil over the winter. I'm actually going to leave these as is because the bees are still really enjoying this. So I'm going to let them enjoy those flowers as long as possible. And with those healthy plants, I will also cut them up into smaller pieces and compost them. But what to do if you have not so healthy plants like these tomatoes, things that might have blight or septoria leaf spot or powdery mildew or any of those things that tend to affect a lot of the plants in our garden. These you want to completely remove, and I actually don't even compost these because, again, I can't guarantee that I'm going to keep my compost hot enough over the winter in order to kill those diseases. And unfortunately, with a lot of these diseases, especially with ones on tomatoes, it can actually overwinter in the soil and affect your plants the following year. So one of the things I really practice in my garden is sanitation. I make sure I completely remove these plants, and I'm not just talking about the stems and the leaves. I dig up the roots, I gather up as much of the fallen fruit as I can. Then I completely dispose of it in my plant waste. If you're able to, you could also burn it. Another sanitation tip is to make sure that you're cleaning your tools between working with diseased plants and working with healthy plants, because you can absolutely spread disease that way. Also, these stakes that I use to hold up tomatoes, I also will sanitize those at the end of the year. Another tip is to practice crop rotation. So I mostly had tomatoes in this bed that were all affected with early blight. And these diseases can linger in the soil for several years. So I don't want to plant tomatoes in this spot again for another few years if I can help it. I also don't want to plant anything in that nightshade family because a lot of these diseases can affect plants within the same family. So I don't want to plant things like peppers here. I don't want to plant eggplant or potatoes. And last, I want to give you a few tips on how to continue to support pollinators, beneficial insects, and beneficial wildlife through the fall and winter. The first is to make sure they still have food sources. So in my vegetable and herb garden, I let a lot of those herbs like that basil go to flower. I also have things like lavender. I plant things like celosia that bloom well into early and late fall as a food source for them. Here in my pollinator garden, I have things like marigolds, sedum, salvia, cleome, and garden mums that bloom in late fall. Plants that are native to your area are going to be the best food source for those pollinators, but anything that blooms that isn't invasive is definitely going to have some benefit for those pollinators. Another way is to leave up the dried seed heads on flowers. You can see some on this Rudbeckia Black-Eyed Susan behind me. And this provides a food source for things like birds over the winter because they don't have access to things like caterpillars or a lot of insects, so they rely on foraging for a lot of their food. Another way is to provide shelter for overwintering insects. When we think of bees, we often think of honeybees that live in hives. But in reality, a lot of our plants are pollinated by solitary bees, bees that aren't social and don't live in hives. And these bees will nest and also overwinter in things like leaf litter or ground litter or in the hollow cavities of stems. The same goes for other beneficial insects like ground beetles. And there's several ways that we can provide these areas for them. The easiest way is to just leave your leaves. When they fall from the trees, leave them on the ground. Not only do they provide sites for these insects to overwinter, but these leaves will break down and feed your lawn and the surrounding plants. If you're not able to or don't want to leave the leaves on the ground, you can brush them into small piles. You can even brush them into your garden or landscaping beds to act as mulch. Another way is if you have herbaceous perennials. These are perennials that will send up new growth from the ground every year, especially ones that have really thick kind of woody stems. So things like raspberries, types of hibiscus. I have rose mallow hibiscus that's great for this, cleome. You want to leave up those dead stems, and not just over the winter, leave them through spring and early summer the following year. So this will provide sites for those beneficial insects to not only nest, but to lay eggs. And there you go. There's some tips and tricks for your fall garden. I have to get going because I have so much work to do over the next few weeks. Don't forget to follow me on my other social media channels where I post easy to follow videos aimed at helping beginner gardeners. Until then, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.